Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Uprooting Trafficking, a three-part virtual series. Thank you for taking the time to be here. I'm Tamara Dirksen, co-creator and facilitator of this series. I serve as Chief of Staff in IT with the Salvation Army, and I founded Uprooting Trafficking to help move awareness into care, support, and action, which is why this series exists. This series was co-created with the Shae Slocum and made possible through the coordination and support of Alex Brierley, whose care and shared vision helped shape these conversations. Tonight's session, Understanding Human Trafficking, lays the foundation for our three-part journey, exploring what trafficking looks like and how collective compassion and action can make change possible. Before we move into our discussion, a few quick notes. Tonight's conversation includes references to human trafficking and exploitation. Please take care of yourself in whatever way you need. Step away, pause, or just breathe. Let's hold this space with empathy and respect for those whose experiences help us understand and do better. The Q&A window will open up later in the session. If you'd like to ask a question, click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type it in. We'll gather them as we go and bring a few forward after the panel. You'll find resources in the resource hub at uprootingtrafficking.com, a great place to learn more and stay connected beyond this series. This session is being recorded and the replay will be publicly available. We'd love your help sharing it so the impact can continue beyond these conversations. Should you get disconnected, the same link will get you back into the session. I'm joining you this evening from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples covered by Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. We honor their enduring presence, and we recognize that Indigenous women and gender-diverse peoples continue to be disproportionately impacted by trafficking. May this conversation move us toward dignity and healing. We're deeply honored that this series is endorsed by the Federated Women's Institutes of Canada, or FWIC, and the WI members from across the country are joining us tonight. We're especially grateful to welcome Lynn MacLean, President of FWIC, whose leadership continues to inspire education, advocacy, and community action across Canada. It's my pleasure to now pass it over to Lynn to share a few words.
Thank you very much, Tamara. It is certainly my pleasure to be here with you on this inaugural event. FWIC is a national network of women, and we're very pleased to endorse this three-part series on uprooting trafficking for several reasons. Our organization's vision centers on creating a future where every woman thrives and makes a meaningful impact in their community. Trafficking poses a direct threat to this vision by stripping victims of control of their own lives and placing it in the hands of those who seek to exploit them. Our members are deeply concerned about trafficking and actively support activities and events that raise awareness and education about its harmful effects on both individuals and society at large. In recent years, many of our WI branches have organized educational sessions within their own communities. Kelly Franklin from the Courage of Freedom has generally shared her personal experience with trafficking with us and highlighted the critical importance of groups working collaboratively to eradicate this crime. We extend our sincere appreciation to the panelists who have dedicated their time to increasing awareness, deepening our understanding, and offering pathways for collective action. Over the course of these three sessions, we look forward to hearing about your experiences and your suggestions for advancing stronger anti-trafficking measures within our communities. We also wish to acknowledge the organizers and Tamara and her group for their commitment to making this significant event a reality, because together we can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, for those inspiring words and for the incredible partnership of the FWIC and its members across the country. We're honored to now welcome the panel, a remarkable group of leaders whose work reflects deep commitment, courage, and compassion in confronting human trafficking. First, we welcome Shae Invidiata, founder of Freedom, a Canadian not-for-profit advancing policy, awareness, and prevention in the fight against human trafficking. Shae's advocacy has contributed to changes in federal legislation and ongoing public engagement on survivor protection across the country. Next, we're joined by Julia Drydyk, Executive Director of the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking. Julia leads national collaboration among survivors, service providers, governments, and the private sector, driving systemic change and shared accountability to end trafficking in all its forms. We're also honored to have Jovana Blagovcanin, I hope I got that right, or at least close, who leads anti-trafficking programs at FCJ Refugee Center and coordinates the Toronto Counter Human Trafficking Network. Jovana is a strong voice for migrant worker rights and justice for precarious and exploited communities. Joining us as well is Cheryl Hotchkiss, Acting CEO and Vice President of International Justice Mission Canada. Cheryl brings over 25 years of experience in social justice leadership and has devoted her career to advancing human rights and building safer, more equitable communities. And finally, Monica McIntyre, founder and director of Aftercare International, a trauma-informed clinician and program designer whose work integrates neuroscience, ethics, and compassion to build sustainable global recovery frameworks for survivors. Please join me in warmly welcoming our panelists for tonight's session. I'm going to start our discussion with you, Shae.
Hello, everyone.
So the first question I'd like to ask you, Shae, in your work, what are the biggest myths Canadians still believe about sex trafficking here at home?
You know, it's crazy because you think of all of the awareness that has been done over the last 10, 15 years, and yet still today, very common, and sorry that you're hearing my little one, but today it's very common that people still think that human trafficking is happening overseas, and not understanding that 80% of victims here in Canada are actually domestic victims of human trafficking. And so, that means that the problem is right here at home, as much as we do have international victims that are trafficked across our borders. But this is a homegrown problem here in Canada. And a lot of people don't realize that. And even when they do learn that, it's still very hard for them to grasp. And oftentimes it's because, sometimes when it's in the media or in movies, theatrical, we think of human trafficking as something that has to be really scary in the beginning, right? Like where there's a kidnap taking place or there's violence, when that's not, that can happen and does happen. But, we see a lot here where it's happening in our neighborhoods, it's in our schools, and not just in public schools, but also in private schools. It's in all different communities. It's not just in low income housing areas. You see this across the board, in affluent communities as well. And so that is a lot that's really hard for people to digest because they don't think that something like this could happen here in Canada, where we've got good borders, we have decent laws. I'm sure the panelists will agree with me that, we could do a little more from that standpoint, but for the most part, that's what the public would think. And so these are some of the, I'm going to say, the myths or misconceptions that, we do a lot of work to try to educate people that it's happening here.
Thanks very much, Shae. I really appreciate the clarity that you offered there. And how do those misconceptions affect how people respond or fail to respond when they see red flags?
Well, here's what begs the question is that, you need to first understand what the red flags are. And so you can't connect the dots if you don't even realize that the issue is happening here. And so I think when you look at youth, right, like the average age of entry into forced prostitution or sex trafficking in Canada is about 13, 14 years old. And so oftentimes when teenagers become teenagers and girls where they're hormonal, right? Like most girls are developing their menstrual cycle for the first time. And so hormones are out of whack, which means attitude could be out of whack. And so a lot of parents misread the signals that when their child is starting to maybe have abrupt behavior or being caught in lies or not even understanding that they might be lying about something, but that there's this frustration that's happening and this frisk, this tension that's happening, that they just chalk it up to say, oh, well, that's the teenager years. And, my child will like me again when hopefully they're 18 or 20 years old. And so that's where you have to educate on what is happening here so that parents, but also adults, like we see this like in the airline industry, in hospitality. And so when staff is educated on the signals of what to look for, then we can say, huh, that's a red flag. And this could be a human trafficking situation. One for a teenager, very common is when all of a sudden they have all these unexplained gifts, right? All of a sudden they have nicer clothes, they have fancy handbags. And it's oftentimes being told it's coming from a boyfriend figure who's gifting them all of these things. And it's not to say that every single time a girl receives a handbag or, gets her nails done from a boy or her boyfriend who's paying for it means that she's being trafficked. No. But when you start to add up all of the different, what we would call red flags, that's where you go, okay, maybe something is happening here. One thing that I think is really, really important that gets overlooked oftentimes is the digital world and the use of apps, especially like gaming apps. It's not a world that I'm focused in. I don't game, but things like Animal Jam, which like Woo's World, where kids are going in and they're creating avatars and there's chat rooms. Anything where there's a chat room. Roblox is another one, and they've been pegged many times for grooming that's taking place in these chat rooms. And so, when maybe a parent walks in and a kid just gets off their phone or like quits the gaming session really quickly with unexplained behavior as to like who are they talking to and why are they doing that? That would be cause for me to go, okay, hand over your phone, hand over the game. Like I want to take a look in these chat rooms to see the conversations that are happening behind closed doors. And so, most importantly, and this is why I'm so grateful to be a part of this, along with the other panelists, is that education is our strongest weapon. And in order to fight this, and I really strongly believe in empowering youth. Like so often we want to shelter. This is a very scary topic. It's a very dark topic, but it is a very strong reality that's happening. And we can't be afraid to talk to our youth and our children around the realities in a child appropriate way, like depending on their age. Because if they don't know the signs and the red flags, somebody else is going to be speaking to your child if it's not you. And so you want to empower them with what might be a red flag so that they come and say to their teacher, to their mom, to their dad, to an aunt, to whoever's, looking after these children to say, I don't know, I got this weird message when I was gaming on Twitch, on Text Now, whatever it is, right, that they're on Snapchat. And how empowering. And I actually had this with my niece. She's now 18, but when she was 16, she called me. She said, Auntie Shae, I'm getting these weird messages from like this guy. And do you think this could possibly be human trafficking. And, you know, obviously we went through that and she's fine and great and nothing happened. But I was so proud of her and her mom. And of course, she has me as her aunt who has been doing this work, but she felt safe to come and speak to me about it, number one. And she felt very empowered. And so this is what we want to instill in our youth and in children, not to make them feel ashamed or that they're going to be in trouble, right? But if you don't know the red flags, you're not going to be able to teach your children. And if we still don't believe that this is happening right here in our own communities, then we can't connect those dots, you know? So, and it can be, like I said, online is strongly happening, but it's also happening in the schools. It's happening at the malls. It's happening at movie theaters. It's happening simple at even coffee shops, you know, very simply. So, um, hopefully I answered that in full. To just say, you know, that would be like, you know, the hard part is that if we don't understand the flags, we actually can't connect the dots.
Yeah, you absolutely answered that very well, Shae. And I appreciated what you said about education being our strongest weapon, and the combination of helping our youth to feel safe and empowered that they can come and talk to us, but at the same time watching for those flags and really being able to connect the dots, because sometimes things aren't what they seem, and some whether it's behavior or things that are happening, we don't necessarily identify it as what it actually is, but together it sort of adds up.
Yes, exactly.
That's great. Thank you very much, Shae.
Mhm.
So Julie, I'd love for you to share your perspective next. From a national lens, what current trends or patterns are you seeing in sex trafficking across Canada? And how do these trends highlight gaps in prevention or support services?
So, as she was saying, unfortunately, the biggest trend in sex trafficking in Canada is that people are being exploited by someone they know and who they often love and trust. So, we know that this often presents as a boyfriend or an intimate partner, but we also see it play out in terms of friends and also family members. So, people really need to understand that this is relational. And I know we're hammering this in, but it's not what it looks like in the movies. According to public opinion polling that we've done, and apologies, I'm a numbers woman, you're going to hear a lot of stats in the next few minutes. Over 91% of Canadians assume that human trafficking only takes place when there's kidnapping or when they're physically forced into the commercial sex industry. More than half of Canadians are completely unaware that the vast majority of exploited people are being exploited by someone they know. And only 15% of Canadians feel like they have enough information about human trafficking to even start that conversation. So traffickers are taking advantage of this. They're leveraging this lack of awareness as part of the coercive control and the manipulation and emotional abuse. As some of you might know, in 2019, the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking launched the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline. So this is a confidential 24/7, 365-day-a-year resource with the primary goal of providing trauma-informed care to connect victims and survivors, as well as friends and family members, with services in their community. So since we actually launched the hotline in 2019, we have received over 23,000 signals. So that includes phone calls, web chats, emails, and web forms. And out of those 23,000 signals, we've identified 2,300 individual cases of human trafficking that involved over 3,300 individual victims and survivors. So out of these cases just identified through the hotline, definitely not the whole picture, just under 70% were sex trafficking cases. And again, these are overwhelmingly situations where it's someone that the survivor knows, loves, and trusts, where you're seeing that pretty regimented scale of luring, grooming, coercion, and exploitation. But I also want to say that the other major form of human trafficking that we're seeing in Canada is labor trafficking. And we're seeing really significant increases in the number of cases that we are identified. So in 2024, when you look at that year alone and when you compare it to the average of the previous 3 years, we saw over a 300% increase in labor trafficking cases. And unlike sex trafficking, this is largely happening with migrant workers in Canada. Unfortunately, there's also a subset that are experiencing sex and labor trafficking at the same time. We're finding also that the service needs are very different based on the type of exploitation. So overwhelmingly, when a survivor of sex trafficking calls the hotline, the most frequent requests for referrals are around housing, shelter, health, mental health, addiction treatment, and case management. They're really looking to meet their basic needs because, similar to forms of intimate partner violence, the most dangerous time for a survivor is when they're leaving their trafficking situation. But labor trafficking, on the other hand, the top requests for referrals are around legal supports and case management. And this makes sense, and I know Jovana is going to talk about this, because they're in a very different perspective of needing to navigate the social service system and to be able to access supports and an exit plan. So I will say that calls to the hotline and identified cases are experiencing an upward trend year over year. And like I said, we think this is only a fraction of the exploitation that we're seeing in Canada every single day. We are receiving calls from the smallest hamlets to the biggest cities, and it truly is a pan-Canadian issue. And I also have to agree with Shae that the lack of awareness and the ongoing myths about human trafficking are our biggest obstacle right now. Days like February 22nd, our National Awareness Day on Human Trafficking, but also any of the campaigns that we do to raise awareness automatically trigger higher calls to the hotline. And like Shae was saying, when people start to know what those red flags are, all of a sudden they realize that there's also somewhere they can go for help. And so we cannot underestimate the power of education and awareness in both responding to what's happening in front of us right now, which is all too frequent, but our ultimate goal, which is also prevention. It's those early conversations. And that's where the hotline comes in as a confidential resource, to be able to talk things out when you're afraid to mention it to anyone else in your life, and to really work with that person where they're at to figure out what options there are for them based on their situations. So I will leave it there for now, but I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you for the hotline that you provide. And for those who are listening, the hotline information is one of the resources that is available in the resource hub at uprootingtrafficking.com. So, Jovana, we are going to bring you into the conversation now, and it's a good lead in what Julia was just speaking about. So where does immigration status intersect with vulnerability to sex trafficking in Canada? And what should people understand about this?
Thanks, Tamara. Yeah, it's immigration status. Really, it's another layer of vulnerability that, it really increases someone's vulnerability, and it also changes the way that someone might be controlled or manipulated. We often see that people are brought to Canada with the promise of, work, or the promise of status. In sex trafficking cases, a lot of the times we see that traffickers, especially if they're a partner, they may bring someone to Canada and promise them that they're going to sponsor them. And they sometimes use status as a way to keep them also in the dark and be able to control them, because without immigration status, it is very difficult to access supports and access services. So somebody might come to Canada, think that they have some sort of application in process, think they have a sponsorship in process, think they have a work permit, but really they don't. And they're left with no status or very precarious status, maybe as a visitor or temporary resident. Then the status is then used later to control them by saying, if you report me, you're the one that's going to be in trouble because you're the one that broke immigration laws. You're working without authorization. And this keeps people fearful, afraid to seek support, and also they're not sure if they can trust authorities now. Even if they get support, or even if they get status, whether that's temporary status, like a temporary resident permit, it's still difficult to access support. It's very difficult to access it without any immigration status if someone is here undocumented. But even with temporary status, they won't be able to get financial assistance if they leave and try to support themselves. They don't have a work permit, they can't work, and then they're all eligible for financial assistance. They're not eligible for special priority housing, for example, the same way that domestic survivors would be because of their temporary status. And so this really does, limit their options of trying to get these essential services like financial support and housing. In addition to the fears of criminalization, because they are afraid that they've committed crimes and they've overstayed their status, they've worked without authorization. Maybe they don't understand their rights, they don't trust authorities, they're afraid they're going to be deported. It keeps them, afraid to seek support and look for support or even know where to find support. And so status is this key piece. It's a way to be controlled, but also a barrier for them to be able to access supports and services and access their rights. I will also mention that, there are some remedies available, and I won't go into detail about them because, that would take longer, but there are some remedies, temporary remedies, immigration remedies that people can apply for if they're eligible, but they're very flawed. They're short term, 1 year, they're temporary. They don't have a clear pathway to permanent residency, and the eligibility requirements are quite limited, and it really excludes a lot of people from being able to apply. And so it keeps people stuck in a limbo where, they're not eligible for this for a temporary resident permit, which is the run remedy. And they also cannot work, and they also cannot apply for housing or get financial assistance. So where do they go and who can support them?
Thank you so much, Jovana. That was very insightful in terms of the complexities that immigration status adds to already difficult situations. And I know that there's information in the Resource Hub as well that can be accessed regarding that. Now let's hear from you, Cheryl. IJM works in communities around the world to protect vulnerable people from violence and exploitation. Can you walk us through how IJM's theory of change actually works in practice?
Sure, thank you. IJM works in about 19 to 20 countries, continuing to expand. And we work in places where there is extreme vulnerability due to economic vulnerabilities, other forms of identity vulnerability, which makes people very vulnerable to the things you've already heard. It's labor exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation, people who are forced into scamming, forced marriage. And so IJM focuses on working in places where we can build relationships, both with the community and the law enforcement community and the justice system. We want to go in places where we believe systemic change is possible because there's a stable enough environment and there's people that are open and willing to having conversations about what needs to be improved. And so we start by working with the community, understanding the specifics of the problem, understanding the challenges that they've faced in receiving justice or receiving fair treatment by police. And then we work alongside community partners in a variety of roles and capacities, changes depending on the country. But we work with police, courts, the social justice, the social services system, to ensure that those systems are functioning properly so that an individual who goes to the police has the chance of being heard, has the chance of the complaint being received, and then it moving through the justice process. For millions of people experiencing trafficking in places where we work, the chances of receiving justice, meaning even reaching the courts, are very, very minimal. And so IJM works to train, mentor, and support justice officials. And what we see happens is when we start to see justice systems working, police understanding that the crimes that people in their community are facing are real, and they need to be fighting for them and protecting them, we see that criminals can't continue their activity with impunity, because that's what they're doing. They know no one cares. They know no one's going to pursue the situation. And so they just proceed to do what they want. And once one's caught, they find another. And so I think what we try to do is create systems where criminals are in fact deterred. They are taken to court. They are given sentences of a substantive nature, so that by one criminal going through the process, the rest of them understand that something's working now and that they don't have the freedom to operate. And we work to create what we call a virtuous cycle: better enforcement, better protection, deeper community engagement, stronger justice systems. And so we've seen, for example, in the Philippines, a 72% reduction in child sex trafficking over a 5-year period. In Cambodia, a 73% reduction in minor child sex trafficking as well. So we know this theory works. We don't try to solve all parts of the problem. We're focused on the justice system because it needs to be ready to receive people when they're ready to have their case pursued.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for those insights and the work that you do. I heard a lot about partnership, community, working together, training, mentoring, supporting, so that those who are able to help are in a position to be able to do that. And both you and Julia have shared some very significant stats that I think we need to sit with for a little while. So thank you for that. Now we're going to keep going and move to you, Monica. There you are. So Monica, you work across borders. How does sex trafficking differ globally in terms of patterns, prevention, and the systems that enable it?
Thank you, and thank you for allowing me to be here tonight. Is a true honor. Working across borders, it was hard to try to group what would those patterns be with all the different nuances and the different realities and the places that we've been. But I gave it a try. So I boiled it down to 4 key patterns. Because the forms of sex trafficking across borders shift, but the roots remain painfully consistent, which are vulnerability, usually inequality, and sadly, demand. What changes is the way those forces intersect in people's lives. So the 4 main patterns that we see would be: the first one, crisis-driven trafficking. This is where there's instability, where traffickers move quickly. We see it among displaced families in different parts of the world, such as internally displaced individuals in South Sudan, or the migration out of Venezuela into Colombia. Those are very good examples of crisis-driven trafficking, or where there's national disasters. No, you know what I'm saying. National, like an earthquake or a tsunami or etc. That becomes a crisis-driven field. When people are desperate to flee danger or find work, individuals who find themselves in these circumstances are exposed to exploitation that is usually disguised behind offers of safety. The second one would be economic coercion. In areas marked by poverty and unemployment, opportunity itself becomes a weapon. False promises of jobs or education lead to debt bondage, to sexual exploitation, to many other forms, begging, forced criminality, etc. It's not always violence that traps a person. Like one of my panelists said, many other times it's the lack of opportunity that traps them. The third one is cultural and systemic exploitation. In some regions, trafficking is sustained by social norms that allow it to exist in the open. Child marriage, caste-based discrimination, or systems that normalize the control of women's bodies all create environments where exploitation is tolerated in the open rather than recognized as abuse. And finally, the digital dimension. Technology has erased borders. The online sexual exploitation of children and the production of CSAM, which is child sexual abuse material, have transformed trafficking into a virtual industry, into a virtual marketplace. A child is in one country and he can be victimized in real time by offenders thousands of miles away. Traffickers no longer need to move victims across borders. The crime itself travels through screens. And like Shae was saying in the beginning, through screens, through apps, through games. When it comes to prevention, the desire to stop, so those are the 4 buckets. Now, we mentioned prevention and systems. When it comes to prevention, the desire to stop trafficking is universal, yet the resources seldom are. In many parts of the world, local officials want to act, but they, for example, in Zambia, we're working with, they have a large team of individuals that are working in the anti-trafficking department, but they're desperate for a printer, for computers, for gas to actually go in and pick up survivors that they know where they are and they need to go get. They don't have the most basic resources to do their job. A budget for awareness or even a place to refer a survivor. And that's what we do at Aftercare International. We support places that are currently running operations because we want them to have survivability and to be able to scale where possible to serve more survivors. But many times there's no actual shelters where they can go to. In wealthier nations, there are stronger systems, but even there, trafficking persists. The reason for this is because prevention can't rely on law enforcement alone. It has to start earlier with things like what we're doing here. You know, it has to start with knowledge. It has to start with opportunity. It has to start with education and the dismantling of the inequalities that make people vulnerable in the first place. And finally, the question was the systems. The systems that enable trafficking usually mirror the realities of a country. Weak protections, corruption, or underfunded services are one side, but there's also sides that are stronger, and those same systems are the ones that we usually find we have to support and try to work in, like the legal part of it, to make the solution stronger.
Thank you very much, Monica, for walking through those patterns, the prevention and the systems. I know that it's a complex issue, and when you look at it globally, similarities, but very, very much differences in different countries and based on different conditions as well. So thank you to each of you for your thoughtful insights and the depth of experience that you've shared tonight. Your perspectives have given us a lot to reflect on, from the realities on the ground to the hope of real change being possible when we work together. So we're now going to move into our Q&A. If you haven't already, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions, and we'll bring forward as many as we can in the time that we have. And we'll also be sharing a Q&A summary in the resource hub at uprootingtrafficking.com, along with related materials and partner resources. So I will now pass it over to Ashani Slocum to lead our Q&A.
Thank you, Tamara, and thank you, panelists, for such great information. I think our first question goes to Julia. And the question is, what areas of labor trafficking have been identified?
I want to start by piggybacking off of something Monica said, and I think Jovana as well. And it's where trafficking thrives due to lack of opportunity. And so when you look at where we're systemically finding labor exploitation, overwhelmingly, it's amongst people in Canada that are often here legally through the temporary foreign worker system. coming in for hopes of a better life, of being able to send money back home, education for their kids, maybe building a life in Canada, but where they structurally have fewer rights than anyone else living and working in Canada. I really struggle with the term modern day slavery with human trafficking, but really, labor trafficking in its existence right now is the most apt description of modern day slavery because it is institutional and it is legal, and because our entire economy depends on it. So, where we are seeing labor exploitation and labor trafficking is largely in those sectors that are incredibly reliant on low wage, what is considered low skill work through temporary foreign workers. And we every year do analysis of the Canada's labor market impact assessments and their data. Overwhelmingly, those industries are agriculture, manufacturing, fisheries, home care. We're also seeing it in some food preparation. And I also, Jovana might be able to jump in on this sometime as well, but this also shifts. So what we are also seeing is that these are often jobs and industries that other Canadians actually don't want to fill, where there's significant shortages. And so rather than investing in the labor standards and what it means to do those jobs well, what we're doing is we're relying on temporary foreign workers who have no mobility rights. They're not allowed to move their employer. So if I'm being abused, I can quit. I can go to a human rights board. They get deported. They get left behind. And so again, that's where we're seeing that systemic and structural exploitation of people that's almost entirely based on preying off of their lack of opportunity and their dreams for a better life.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. That's a great response. The second question that we're going to bring forward is directed to Jovana. And it states, has the current situation in the US with ICE raids happening increased human trafficking cases? Increased in Canada, assuming illegal people in the US are looking to come into Canada as an escape.
Well, I can't speak to like numbers or if it's increased cases of human trafficking. What I can say is that there is a rising anti-immigrant rhetoric that's in Canada, that a lot of these crises that we have, unemployment, housing crisis that we have, are being blamed. The blame is being shifted to migrants. And this is impacting a lot of policies that we have. And maybe it's a direct result from what's happening in the States, but it is an issue here in Canada. And we're seeing that policies are changing that are restricting rights for migrants or their ability to be able to gain status, to be able to support themselves in Canada, and access their rights. And this ultimately leads to them being even more vulnerable to exploitation, where more people are falling out of status. They had a plan in Canada. They took out loans to come to Canada. I'm thinking about international students, for example, who came to Canada with a plan, and then policies were changed right underneath them. And this is leaving a lot of international students who are going to be out of status. And now they're going to have to look for cash jobs to be able to support themselves and pay back those loans they took to be able to have a future in Canada. And this just only increases the risk of somebody taking advantage of that and exploiting them. And so there is, a risk of cases rising because of this, but this is something that I can't just say is because of the US, because our Canadian governments are listening to the pressures of the anti-immigrant voices.
Thank you. Thank you, Jovana, for your explanation. Tamara, I'll hand it over to you for your closing comments and remarks.
Thank you very much, Ashani. And so if you have any remaining questions and want to put them in the chat, then we will Q&A. We can address them either now, or some of the questions we'll be able to include in the resource hub as well. I just wanted to open just for a second to the panelists just to see, is there anything that you would like to add on very briefly to anything that your fellow panelists have said based on the discussion tonight? I see, Cheryl, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I think based on what I've heard from colleagues and what we've seen successes with addressing the problem of trafficking is when you have an integrated response. And I think that our colleagues have spoken of brokenness in different parts of the system, and certainly Canada has brokenness. And where we've seen success is where people come together across, from the police, the judiciary, the support systems, the immigration systems, survivor supports, and social workers, and so on. And with that, more sustainable and unique solutions are built to address a problem that is very complex and nuanced to the location which it is taking place in.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for adding that. Any other comments or anything else in the Q&A before we move into our closing remarks? I'll just wait a few seconds for any hands.
I'll just, if I can speak quickly.
Yes,
I'll
please.
just do
Absolutely.
a shameless plug as well, that we are going to be releasing a new report detailing data from the hotline for the last 6 years later this fall. So folks can stay tuned for that for more information. And also, if I know this can be triggering, it can raise some alarm bells. So if anyone wants any support or thinks something might be wrong, please call the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-833-900-1010. We're here for you.
Thank you very much, Julia. And maybe if you can just repeat that number one more time, then Alex, if you're able to put that in the chat, that would be terrific.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's 1-833-900-1010.
Terrific. Thank you very much. All right. So with that, I want to extend again a huge thank you to our panelists. As we close to tonight's first session, thank you for your expertise and your courage, and to each of you for joining us from across Canada and from other places in the world as well. Your engagement truly matters. Every question and reflection is part of how we uproot trafficking together through awareness, empathy, and collective action. To learn more about our panelists and their organizations, please visit the partners page on uprootingtrafficking.com. And if you feel inspired, there are meaningful ways to get involved or offer support. Tomorrow evening, we continue with session 2, restoration and reintegration, focused on pathways of recovery, resilience, and hope for survivors and the communities that walk alongside them. And I really hope that you'll join us for that. And I'll leave you with the words of Dr. Jane Goodall. You cannot get through a single day without having an impact on the world around you. What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. Thank you again to our speakers, to the Federated Women's Institutes of Canada for their partnership, and to each of you for being part of this growing movement. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.